and welcome to today's special episode of Crash Course Theater History. Let's get started with some Twelfth Night. Okay, so let's imagine that you're in London for the 1600s for the winter holidays, and you'd be thinking, great, Christmas and New Year's. Well, you'd be wrong. The holiday season we're talking about is Twelfth Night, a day of celebration and revelry taking place from the end of the 12 days of Christmas, which, contrary to popular belief, were not the 12 days prior to Christmas, but were in fact the 12 days beginning with the holiday. Twelfth Night was a carnival celebration, the night before the Christian holiday of Epiphany on January 6th. There was a lot of food and drink and many shenanigans, like men dressing as women and women dressing as men and servants acting above their class. Sound familiar? No? You haven't read the play? Then maybe we should move on to the play that this is all about, which, not so coincidentally, shares the name with the holiday. It's Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, or what you will. This is a comedy, which means it ends in marriage, which means you can expect a lot of wacky romantic comedy shenanigans. Let's take a look, shall we? So you have twins named Sebastian and Viola, and they're on a voyage, and then they get separated during a crash while they're at sea. Viola ends up in Illyria and disguises herself as a eunuch named Cesario so that she can work under the Duke of Illyria, Orsino. Orsino is madly in love with a noblewoman named Olivia, who falls in love with Cesario, who is actually Viola, who has meanwhile fallen in love with Orsino. Then her long-lost twin Sebastian shows up and all hell breaks loose. Meanwhile, Olivia's maidservant Maria and Festi the Clown team up with Olivia's drunken Uncle Toby and then their other drunk friend Sir Andrew to exact revenge on the uppity Puritan Malvolio. Maria writes Malvolio a letter pretending to be Olivia, making it sound as though she's in love with him and asking him to perform a variety of ridiculous tasks to prove that, he returns her love. By the end of the play, these antics have gotten Malvolio thrown in jail, where Olivia has married Sebastian, thinking he's Cesario. Cesario's true identity is revealed as Viola. The twins are reunited, and Duke Orsino realizes that he's not gay after all. And, Toby agrees to marry Maria. All's good. So this sound familiar? It might be because you saw the 2008 version of it called She's the Man with Amanda Bynes. Bring in the dancing lobsters. But it just modernizes it. So obviously the humor of this plot has survived, but what would it have been like if you were part of Shakespeare's audience? Say that you find yourself in the Globe Theater, I don't know, about February of 1602. Now the Globe itself is an impressive structure. It's about an open-air theater, about 3 stories tall, 100 feet in diameter. So you have your sitting upstairs for the snooty upper-class types, like the Queen if she's coming to visit, but then you also have that standing room area only for the rabble, the lower class, your peanut gallery, where they could eat and they could drink, and then they could yell and, shout at the actors if they sucked or something. So the stage itself stands approximately 5 feet high at the rear of the theater, with a roof being held by 2 columns at the sides of the stage. You probably can't see it, but there's a trapdoor built for entrances and exits, as well as a few of your more traditional doors. There's also a balcony area for those mocking scenes where you're yelling at those pesky imprisoned Puritans and their yellow cross-gartered legs. Ugh. And that was as far as your set went. Rather with elaborate scenery as we use today, Shakespeare and his company relied on the space that they were given and the power of language to convey the necessary setting. And what they lacked in scenery, they made up for in costumes. Twelfth Night, for example, is set in what sounds like the magical land of Illyria. And Illyria is more or less magical and a lot more real. We don't know if Shakespeare went there himself, but we do know Illyria is a small little island off the shore of the Balkan Peninsula. Right here. So you think that the costumes would look a little bit Mediterranean or Middle Eastern, something like that. But you'd be wrong. The costumes were actually modern Elizabethan dress, like this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this. Not that! But you get the idea. When the actors came on stage for the first time, unless you're a member of the upper class, you probably would have been paying attention to what they were wearing as well as what they were saying. This is because what we considered to be period dress was actually high fashion for what we consider to be Shakespeare's actors. Everything that we find funny, from the cross-gartering or ribbons tied around the knees of Malvolio's stockings, to the puppian pants, to the elegant dresses Olivia would have certainly worn, that would have been based off of the high-class Elizabethan society. Of course, this type of clothing wasn't particularly inexpensive. High-class clothing, even then, was worth a lot of money, so the costumes would often be kept from show to show after being donated by a generous patron or painstakingly crafted for a particular performance. Beyond the equivalent of eye candy, these costumes played an incredibly important role with the context of the show as well. A purple costume, for example, would immediately tell you about the character on stage. During the time period, purple clothing was particularly difficult to come by. So if a character was wearing purple on stage, you could pretty quickly assume that they were a character with either a lot of wealth or a lot of power.
Phil, why was the color purple so rare? I mean, did they have something against the color purple or what?
Well, the truth of the matter is, synthetic clothing dyes weren't really invented until the late 19th century, so the more rare the material used to make the dye, the more rare the color, the more expensive it was. For the color purple, that meant sea snail secretions.
Wait. Snail excretion? Like snail poop?
Well, less poop and more slime, because we have to have alliteration, you know, sea, snail, secretion, slime. Yeah. The snail slime would be turned into a purple dye, which then would be applied to the clothing. But because the slime came from, you know, sea snails, it cost a lot to dye anything purple. However, the clothing in the plays would have been used to represent what actual nobles were actually likely to wear. So it wasn't far of a stretch to imagine that Duke Orsino and Livia would be wearing at least one purple clothing. For Orsino, that might mean a purple vest, or a blouse, or stockings, yes, the pumpkin pants. For Olivia, that might be a purple gown or accents. Now that we know what they're wearing, let's talk a minute about who had been wearing it. Now, as was the custom in the period, women were not allowed to perform as actors, meaning that Shakespeare's company would have been an entirely male cast.
So let me get this straight. You would have a man playing a woman who's pretending to be a man?
I know, it sounds confusing, but for Shakespeare's audience, it really wouldn't have been. However, it would mean that the actors would have to change their behavior based on what characters they were playing. So when it comes into the acting of the period, the biggest concern of how people stood depending on the costumes that they were wearing. So the men would be wearing pants and the women would be wearing dresses. This sounds familiar. But the men would also have a belt which would hold their sword, or dagger, or other sharp, pointy thing of death. So this sharp, pointy thing of death would have to be carried in a scabbard of sorts, but then that would, you know, wiggle around, and no one wants their really long thing hanging around their waist. Thus, the men would have to hold their swords at all times, and so to do that, they'd look like sassy gentlemen with their arms at their waist holding their swords. This was known as the Renaissance elbow. So the men usually stood with the Renaissance elbow, which, you know, held their dagger. That would take up their left arm. As for their feet, they would stand in third position, which we know as today in ballet. They would sometimes relax a bit, and that would just be taking a step forward. Women, on the other hand, were very simple, and it was just a neutral stance. But in the case of their hands, that had sass. So prim and proper ladies would have all their hands nice and tight, probably around their waist, a little bit at their bosoms. But then big body women like Mariah would have their arms right here, giving everybody sass. As with how the actors would actually speak and perform the text, well, Hamlet gives us the best advice on how to do that. Speak the speech, I pray you, and pronounce it trippingly off the tongue. So as long as the actors could take in the poetic nature of the verse, the images mostly came out. Some actors were better than this than others, you know, including the famous Richard Burbage, who was known to play Duke Orsino. But of course there are always other actors playing the other characters. Shakespeare is known for playing characters within his plays. He's credited as being one of the original actors to play the captain. But then there was the mysterious Ned, who played Viola, and some people believe that Shakespeare played Ned, which would make it weird because then Shakespeare would be having a conversation with Shakespeare in Act 1, Scene 1 about Shakespeare's twin! I love this play! This has been your crash course in Twelfth Night. If you wanted more information, please go read the book.
We're extremely high today.
Puff levels! Puff levels!